So the session is recorded and it will be available on our webinar page. So you will be able to view it later or share it with other members of your team. So this morning we're going to be looking at policies and procedures, which is probably never the way that anybody wants to start their morning. But hopefully we'll try and keep it fast moving and keep the information as relevant as possible to you. So these have been extraordinary times and they've required us to act quickly and flexibly. And our sector has really risen to the challenge. We've been phenomenal, to be honest with you, in our response, in the way that we've adapted to meet needs in our community over something completely unprecedented that we've never seen the like of before. And dealing with a crisis is very different from dealing as we move forward through recovery from COVID-19. And so the way in which we've probably been able to act so flexibly and so quickly is because we've probably just stepped to the side of our policy documents. We've let the needs of our community dictate the way that we've carried out our procedures. And actually, all of the main regulatory bodies have supported that approach. They've said that actually that's the right way to work in an emergency. But as we move out of that crisis, out of that emergency, we need to make sure that we are in step with our policies and procedures. We need to make sure that the new ways of working fit in with our own current guidelines. And if we don't do that moving forward, that's when we're likely to trip ourselves up in light of regulations and, of course, legislation. Now, even as we're talking, things are changing. So we know that there's an update from the government happening at 4 o'clock today, talking about social gatherings. And I know that that will have caused some consternation for any of you involved in village halls, community buildings, or anywhere where in fact people gather. At the moment, we don't have any more guidance than you do. So we don't know exactly how it's going to affect community buildings or any multi-purpose facility. We do know that there seems to be some level of exemption for restaurants and pubs. We don't know what that will be yet. And also for team sports. So until the guidance comes out in full, I wouldn't want to speculate on what the impact is going to be for our community buildings. But what we will do is put out a release today after the 4 o'clock briefing with what we think is probably best practice guidance based on what comes out of today's briefing. We will also make sure that we include it in our next week's webinar to make sure that we're able to give the most up-to-date advice, which hopefully we will receive from ACA and from other regulatory bodies, as well as the fact, of course, that because it's due to come in next Monday, there should be legislation to back it up. So we will have that as well, which we'll be able to give you next Wednesday. So I'm sorry we can't give you more information on that, but it keeps us all on our toes. So the first part that I'm going to just share with you is a little agenda for today, just so that you've got some idea of what it is that we're going to be going through. So I'm going to have a little look right now, working from home guidance, which of course has been a massive change that's taken place. There's more remote working going on than there ever has been before. But also for some organisations, they're going to have staff returning to work and there are implications there, and it's making sure that your current policies and procedures reflect those changes. Julie's going to take us through looking at safeguarding, good practice guidance that's come up through the COVID-19, things that we need to think about in relation to our policies. And then Anita is going to take us through fundraising and the way that that's changed, particularly with more of an online focus, and a little bit of signposting to the guidance that we've already given out around village halls. I'll then be doing some work around GDPR and data protection and guidance that's come out from the Information Commissioner's Office. We'll do a little update from us and then our funding update at the end. So quite a bit to get through, but what we will be providing is good resources as always to back up today's webinar so that you'll be able to go to our webinar page to see all of the links or any of the PDF documents that we've discussed today. Okay, back in the room. So working from home policy. So you've probably got lone working policies, you've probably got policies on using display screens, IT policies, and you may even have a working from home policy already. But I would say that this is the time to get those policies out in particular and have a look at them in light of the new ways of working. And make sure that they do reflect what your staff are doing. I think working from home is a particular issue because for many of us, working from home was incidental. Very few people work from home for a prolonged period of time. They might just do an occasional part of a day working from home, or maybe even just one day a week. And of course, the safeguards that we need to have in place when people are just working incidentally from home are very different to the safeguards we need to have in place for people who are working from home for a majority of their working week. So risk assessments become very important. And of course, they're very difficult to do remotely. There is some good guidance out there, however. So WorkSafe have produced a really good assessment. It's incredibly comprehensive. It's about 6 pages, which sounds daunting, but it's very checklisty. But it's a really good way of looking at the environment that people are working in, to look at things like the desks they may be working on, their chairs. And there's also some good practice guidance in there for staff as well about the things they can do to improve their own health. Also goes as far as looking at stress, which is, I think, really important. So that kind of comprehensive checker may not be relevant for everybody, but I would recommend having a look at it, because what you might want to do is pull out the salient 5, 6, 7 questions that would be really good to ask your staff to look at when working from home. Remember also that we may have trustees who would normally have come into an office, so it may also affect those. And you might also have volunteers who are going to be working from home, whatever that may be, befriending, or whether it may be doing some administration. And again, that would need to be embedded into your policies and procedures. This is about looking at what you've got and making sure it reflects what you do. Keeping in contact is very important as well, and often that's a good thing to make sure it's embedded within your procedures. How often will you keep in contact? How will you keep in contact? Will there be opportunities for teams to get together remotely to be able to keep in contact, either formally or through coffee morning type arrangements where staff can actually take 15, 20 minutes to spend time with each other and catch up on their lives? These are the things that incidentally happen in an office, and they keep us well and often keep us sane. So it's quite important that we look at opportunities for people to get together. The Institute of Occupational Safety have brought out some really good free resources as well, and we will be providing the link for those, particularly around leading a team remotely, which can be quite a challenge for a trustee board, for a management team, or just for a single line manager to make sure that they are keeping in contact and that people do feel supported. Remote has connotations with it. It also sounds like isolated, and it's very easy for people to feel that way. Simple email messages, simple just checking in with people, regularly reminding people that they can contact you. All of those things are so important. The Information Commissioner's Office have also brought out some guidance around working from home to make sure that privacy is protected. And again, that link will be provided in our resources for today. One of the main things they highlight is about the devices being used, whether they are owned by the individual, owned by the company, whether they're owned by the individual using company software. And each of those come with their own challenges. And it's very important when looking at how people are working from home that we also look at what they're working from home on. We often have to deal with some level of personal information, even if it's just collecting names, having email addresses. So it is worth doing a full look at how people are working from home and how they're communicating. Excuse me, there's a security checklist that the ICO provide, which talks about your remote working or working from home policy, making sure that your software is up to date. That's key, because that's often what prevents viruses from getting through on computers. Making sure that you've got unique and complex passwords, and when necessary, multi-factor authentication. That's where you have to sign in, say, for example, both on a phone and on a computer. If you're working with high-level sensitive data, then it is recommended you're using multi-factor authentication. You can Google it, and of course you can also get advice from us if that's something you're not sure whether you should be using or how you might use it. Some other areas that ICO highlight are to do with cloud storage, making sure that your settings don't allow it to be public. Some of the cloud software that is available does actually make public by default. So do make sure that you've got it set so that it's private, your organisation only. Make sure that only key staff have full access to the site. So those that need to have it do, and for the rest they have much lighter touch. Again, it prevents inappropriate sharing of documents. And make sure that you've got all of the appropriate firewalls and everything that you need to have in place to make sure that it is secure. If you're using remote desktops, I apologise about that. If you're using remote desktops, then do make sure that you've got your login secure, again, that you're using good passwords, not the standard generic ones that often come with apps. And again, make sure that only key staff have actually got access. One of the biggest breaches that happens when it comes to data protection actually comes through emails. And it's by putting everybody's names into the CC box or into the to box. It's really important that you use the BC, the blind copy, which means you can put everybody's email addresses into that box and nobody else can see them. Now, unless you know that everybody you're communicating with has given you permission to use that email, it's better to be safe than sorry and to include them in a BC box. As I say, it's probably the most common data breach that can happen. So it's a really important one to make sure that staff are aware. If you do have an IT or remote working or home working policy, it should be embedded in there as a reminder to everybody. There's some good guidance from the National Cyber Security Centre on how to avoid phishing emails as well, which is another way that computers get infected or contacts end up being shared. It is important to try and avoid as much as possible using personal email addresses. So we've talked to lots of organisations for a long time about the fact that it is good to set up an organisational email address. Now, internal communications often are fine if you're using personal, so trustee to trustee, for example, but there's always the possibility of data breach, of sharing somebody's name or information accidentally or without thinking, and then suddenly that's now on somebody else's private computer, and ultimately that can be a data breach. So it is worth considering setting up email addresses for your organization so that you're all using organizational email addresses so that everything is accessible through a central administration if needed. It's the safest way to communicate by email. And there's lastly just a little bit more information from ICO about video conferencing. So things like Zoom and Teams, they've become quite ubiquitous to the way that we've dealt with COVID-19. I kind of wish I'd bought shares in Zoom at the beginning of all this because I might actually be announcing my retirement today. But unfortunately I didn't, hindsight, eh? But it is important to think about the security of the system that you're using. Zoom have worked very, very hard during this COVID-19 to make sure that they've adapted what they're doing to keep it as secure as possible. So they now have by default password settings, waiting rooms, and these are a really good way to make sure that you don't have people bombing your meeting or that you don't have unwanted people turning up. So you've got a waiting room and can only admit those you're expecting. You can also put settings in as well to evict people from the Zoom meeting who are behaving inappropriate, and you can also prevent them from coming back in. You need to use those sensitively though, because of course people's internet connection can drop out and they can end up leaving a meeting and then they can't get back in. So you need to be careful about how you use that. I would recommend it where you've got people who are particularly vulnerable and where there is the potential for outbursts or people to become upset. But I think otherwise it's probably better to just enforce ejecting people from the meeting if they continue to behave badly. Again, make sure that you've got software updates fixed so that you're getting those latest updates, even though sometimes they can be annoying, can't they, Ray? When you think you've mastered exactly how everybody signs into Zoom or Eventbrite, and then we get a software update and suddenly it's all different. But at the same time, it's there to protect us from those viruses that obviously can corrupt the systems that we're using and can leave people vulnerable to data breaches. So it's really important that that's done. I'd also seriously recommend having protocols of how to work. We joke about people turning up in their pajamas, and there is obviously always that wondering about how many of you are wearing trousers when we have our Zoom meetings. I do always like to think it's all of you, makes me happy. But it is important sometimes to have these protocols actually in writing so that there are clear understanding about what is acceptable. In a formal meeting, for example, it's not a good idea to be in your bedroom. That may be the only place that you have where you can have good internet access. If that's the case, then you need to be looking at your background. Is there anything you can put behind you Can you actually put an artificial background behind you? And if you know how to do that. The same would also be said of clients, particularly vulnerable clients that you might work with, and making sure that those protections are in place for them. So just a quick word really on flexible working. So there obviously are guidance and rules and laws around flexible working, such as people who've worked for an organisation for more than 26 weeks can make an application for flexible working, and that's something everybody can do once a year. But what we found during this time is that we've been asking people to work flexibly, and moving forward, that's probably going to continue. And really, if we want to make this an opportunity to improve people's home, work lives, then actually we want to try and encourage people to work flexibly. Do we need to do 9 to 5? Do people need to do continuous working days, or actually can that be broken up with segments in between where you stop to provide lunch for your family or an evening meal and then come back to the work that you're doing? How flexible can you be? So it's worth thinking about the parameters of flexibility within your organisation and how actually you can make that work-life balance better for the people that you work with, while also making sure that you've had the effective discussions. A good practice would dictate you discuss with your staff first, you plan the change that you're going to make, you do it, you then check, and you act if you find things that aren't working. But that discussed thing should happen first. It's not flexible if it's imposed by others. Flexible is about talking to your staff and finding out what works for them. Some really, really good examples of this from the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, CIPD, and we will be linking both to their site and also to the guidance that they provide in a handout. So finally from me, going on to returning to work. And I think it's probably worth including within this section those of us that have been at work all through the COVID-19. So when you've got people coming back, it's very easy to think about the risk assessments that you need to do, that you need to check that they're working safely from home, think about your vulnerable staff team. But actually we need to take a stop and a pause and to think about those who are working and who have been working throughout, to make sure that we have risk assessments for them, that we've looked at their safe home working, that we thought about their vulnerabilities. So this is a good moment to really do that pause as we bring people back. When it comes to looking about whether staff should come back, then the first question is it essential? Flexible working has been working for you. If remote working has been working for you, then do you need to bring people back? And it is a good question to ask, particularly in light of the fact that we know that there are changes and fluctuations in the number of cases that are being reported, and the safety levels are constantly in a state of flux and probably will be until we ride through the winter. So it is an important question to ask. The next one is, if it's essential for them to come back, is it safe? And that means, is it safe for people? Is the workspace safe? Is equipment safe? And do you have the systems in place? That's what we mean by safe. Not just that we've done an arbitrary risk assessment, but actually the conclusion of that risk assessment is that people, workplaces, equipment, and our systems are working safely. And probably most importantly, finally, is it mutually agreed? Now, of course, if you insist that staff must come back, then they are bound by their contract to return. But you're never going to get the best out of a workforce that is being coerced or forced into a situation they feel uncomfortable with. Talk through with staff, use things like the WorkSafe guidance that I talked about earlier, and other, which I will actually come on to talk about, other toolkits that are available to make sure that staff feel comfortable returning to the workplace. And speaking of toolkits, Healthy Working Lives, which is actually a Public Health Scotland document, is an excellent toolkit. It's very, very comprehensive. You may just want to dip in and out of it to find whether it's got what you need in there. But it has, for example, a letter template asking staff to return to work. It has a really nice staff questionnaire as a way of addressing concerns that people might have about returning to their office environment. Then there's also a really good template for if you do an interview with staff or you talk to staff about returning. And there's also some really good resources around mental health and stress as well. Mind have also brought out a really good wellness action plan, which is worth exploring with staff as they go through this difficult time, particularly if returning to a very different working environment than the one that they knew before. That's quite a lot of information to take in about working from home and returning to work. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. So as you can see, there are an awful lot of links there, but each of these I've kind of broken up into the sections that we're talking about today. And what they should do is take you directly to the guidance that I've given, and also to the helpful toolkits or working documents that you might need. We'll also be providing some support guides as well. So where the organisations that I've talked about have provided these PDF documents, it's easier obviously for you to access those rather than necessarily go to the site and try to find them. And those will all be available on our webinar page. Okay, at that point, I'm going to hand over to Julie. Julie has really had quite IT struggles this morning, so we are so grateful to see her. And Nisa is going to be doing her slides for her. So please do bear with us if there's any kind of lag between the transition of slides. Thank you, Julie.
Thanks, Paula. Thank you. So this morning, I'm just going to give you a brief update on safeguarding policies and procedures, as you can see. So the coronavirus pandemic has meant that many organisations had to have had to change the way they operate on a day-to-day basis. Schools, colleges, nurseries are beginning to welcome back children who they haven't seen for several months. Other agencies and organisations may still be reliant on remote or distance contact, and they may be less able to recognise protection concerns and provide appropriate support. You may have found it difficult to keep your safeguarding and protection policies up to date and reflect the ongoing changes in the ways of working. So here are the 5 steps that Anita's kindly put up for me to consider what updates your organisations can make to your policies and procedures to ensure everyone is kept safe. So this is really a gentle reminder of what you should be doing already, and you know, whether or not you need to amend your existing procedures. So going on to the next slide, policies and procedures. So below is again another reminder of the policies and procedures you should already have in place. You can see them all there. I don't need to read them all out. You can follow the links below for further advice from the charity ethical principles, safeguarding children for voluntary and community groups, and the governance code as well. And as Paula said, these will all be available on our website. So just moving on to types of abuse. So this is really what has perhaps changed in recent times with the COVID situation. You'll see there's a list of the types of abuse that you should be safeguarding and looking out for. And there's different indicators of abuse as well. So sort of moving on to the big one at the moment is the financial abuse. That's on the next slide. So we can assume that the greatest opportunity for abuse during COVID crisis is financial. With additional pressure on services, normal service reductions, fear and isolation, the window is open to those who may seek to exploit those who may be vulnerable. There were early reports of a 400% increase in fraud reporting in March relating to the COVID-19 crisis. The Chartered Trading Standards Institute has warned the public not to open their doors to bogus healthcare workers claiming to be offering home testing for COVID-19. It has been hugely positive to see communities coming together to offer support to people who require assistance. A large number of people are offering to help their neighbours through this difficult time and do so genuinely and for good reason. However, unfortunately, there may be some people who aim to take advantage of the situation, and it is important to be aware of these potential scams. If someone you don't know offers you help, try to find out more about them. You don't need to accept an offer from someone who turns up on your doorstep. Instead, ask where they live and how you can contact them should you decide you need help. So on to the next slide, please. So basically, these points are very important. Don't feel pressurised to accept help from a stranger. Don't hand over money, bank details or bank cards to someone you don't know. If someone offers to do your shopping, ask for a receipt. You can pay them on their return to cover the cost of the items. If someone claims to be from a recognised organisation, then don't be afraid to ask to see proof or check. If you feel you have been a victim of a scam or would like further information, there's an Action Fraud helpline below. If possible, call a friend or family member to discuss the help that you've been offered. So that's from the financial abuse. So on to domestic abuse. So I've listed some numbers here where people that are suffering from domestic abuse can get help. Domestic abuse is a form of any abuse committed by a partner, former partner or family member. This includes adult children harming older parents. People often think of domestic abuse affecting younger people, but any person, any age, any gender can experience it. Living in close proximity with someone for a prolonged period can exacerbate existing issues. If you live with someone who you feel at risk from, seeking help may be difficult, especially if you're reliant on them for your care and support needs. So, as I say, here's some numbers, and that you should share within your organisation and have on your safeguarding policies for quick access. And neglect. So a lot of people would have received care and support in their own home, but they might be struggling because care staff have been off sick. So just bear in mind, care services may be busier than usual, no doubt need to deal with the fact that staff need to take time off if they are unwell. You might experience some changes to your normal services, such as seeing different carers, workers, or receiving visits at different times of the day. If your usual visits don't take place and or you don't receive your medication or other necessary supplies, you need to contact your care provider and or the adult care social team at your local council for help. If you are reliant on a voluntary carer, usually a friend or family member for your health and care needs, and they're no longer to help support you, get in touch with the local council, the adult social care team. And I'm whipping through this, onto online safety, using social media safely. So again, Paul has covered a lot of this already, but it's so important that our safeguarding policies are updated to take this into account. There are lots of benefits for organisations, staying in contact with people and providing specialist support, promoting events and live streaming activities. But you really do have to put measures in place it's just important for organisations and groups to put safeguarding measures in place if they are communicating online. So on the next slide, I've given you another reminder of what you should be doing when you're working online. Safeguarding policies and procedures, as we keep talking about, appropriate language and behaviour, privacy and consent, setting up and managing online forms, and live streaming safely. And again, there's another link there for safer internet. So what can you do to help? You should talk to your patients, residents or clients about the increased risk of abuse at this time. You can be aware that any changes in behaviour or demeanour could indicate abuse. Advise people not to answer the door to strangers. Oh, I don't need to read it all now because it's all there. Try not to alarm people, but ask them to be wary of offers of help, particularly from strangers. Advise people to check with family. Warn people against responding to any text, email or phone call from an identified source. Advise people they should never give their personal data, passwords or PIN numbers to anyone. If you know of a person that is being subjected to or is at risk of domestic abuse, if it is safe to talk to them, try and assess the current situation and make sure they know what help is available. Okay, so on the following 3 slides, you'll find checklists and tools to help you review what your organisation is already doing. There's loads of safeguarding templates, checklists, and also numbers for support. So if you're dealing with a particular audience, age concern, for example, they can help with staying safe during coronavirus outbreak. Social Care Institute for Excellence is some really good resource on their website. And obviously there's us as well, Dorset Community Action. There's loads of helpful advice on our website, but you can also contact a community advisor if you need any specific help. And that's me done. Okay.
Brilliant. Thanks, Julie. I guess it's over to me. So I am going to do a slightly different order to Paula's agenda because I'd already done my slides, so sorry. But a very quick look at village halls and policies, good practice policies and procedures. We've covered this in quite a lot of our webinars. We had that wonderful webinar with Deborah Clark from ACRE, Bernard Hammock from Hallmaster, and Bozina from Allied Westminster. So, I think it was, I can't remember the date because they've all merged into one. But anyway, so my suggestion for a first port of call for looking at advice would be go back and review that webinar about the advice and guidance about reopening safely. But I guess the two main things in terms of village halls are risk assessments and your hall hire terms and conditions, and make sure that they reflect social distancing, the cleaning routines, what you expect of your hirers, so everybody's clear about what is expected of them, and then meeting those terms and conditions to ensure that you're complying with your insurance and health and safety. Obviously, test and trace, or track and trace, I always get them wrong, has implications for GDPR. So again, that's another policy that you need to look at to make sure you're reflecting the information that you need to collect in terms of that. And I know Paula's going to touch on that in a minute. And I guess this, I put management and supervision in because actually this is, again, relates to bringing back your workers and your volunteers, that actually some of your procedures in doing supervision to make sure do those checks, make sure people are okay, that their health and safety is being managed, and then you can touch on things like safeguarding in those sort of one-to-one meetings. So some of those procedures around management and supervision may also need to be looked at. I'm going to look at financial controls and fundraising in my next bit because there's an overlap. And I guess the other area, if you do have like a communications policy, which might cover social media, again, in light of COVID-19, we are doing a lot more communicating via email or electronic methods, and not so much in terms of face-to-face. So again, just ensure that if you have any policies and procedures, that they reflect your new ways of working. So a policy is basically a statement of your principles and how you're going to operate, and make sure that you comply with any legislation. And the procedure is really how you're going to implement that and the actions you're going to take. So that there should be two elements to your policies and procedures. One thing that I haven't put on this, but I had a phone call that prompted this morning, is if this applies to all organisations, not necessarily village halls, but because of the electronic communications and our requirement to meet either as trustees or AGMs and that thing, some of the older constitutions, so that basically what I'm saying is might also be worthwhile having a look at your constitution. Some of the older constitutions don't have any powers for you to hold or communicate with your trustees or members or whatever by electronic means. So given that COVID-19 isn't going away in the near future, and we are seeing local lockdowns and increasing restrictions or potential increase in restrictions on movements and meetings, then actually if you haven't got a power or a clause within your constitution that enables you to communicate and make decisions electronically, now might be a good time to review and include a clause in your constitution or governing document that enables you to do that. So that's something around governance. Sorry, really whistle stop, but I'm going to go on to fundraising. Again, we had two webinars on the 8th of July and the 12th of August, where we looked at the changes in terms of the Code of Fundraising Practice. And this has implications on or as a result of like social distancing, holding fundraising events where you cannot have groups of or large groups of people. And again, we're seeing that being tightened up. We don't quite know how that's going to impact on us. But also there are implications in terms of COVID, how we collect money. So we're seeing lots a lot fewer cash donations and donations by cheque, and the donations are now being managed by more through electronic means. So that has an implication on your financial controls policy, how you're doing your, whether you have petty cash and those sorts of things. So again, review your, now's a good time to review your funding or fundraising policies, financial controls, claiming expenses, how you pay expenses. You may have issued checks before. Well, that's not going to be, that might not be what you're doing from now on. But also, again, if you are doing fundraising events, and your ways of communicating have an implication for your GDPR and social media policy. The other area that would be worthwhile looking at, which is more of a finance rather than a sort of fundraising, is obviously the lockdown and organisations being mothballed. Although we've had great support from our local council and other funders, it has had an impact on our level of reserves. Now, there hasn't been very good guidance from the Charity Commission on what a good level of reserve should be. And I know that from the work that I've done, not all organisations have a reserve policy. So again, now would be a good time to look at your financial sustainability and look at implementing or putting in place a financial reserve policy, so that regardless of what happens in the future, you're in a more secure position going forward. So again, build up some reserves that enable you to weather another storm or another crisis, whatever it may be, even if COVID-19 goes away. So that's sort of really what I wanted to say. Obviously, good practice, demonstrate good practice. There's lots in the governance code around finance and fundraising and what trustees should be demonstrating to provide good practice and good governance. Internal financial controls, so there's a link there, and as the others have said, this will be available on our website, but there's a link there to the Charity Commission website, and also DCA has an example financial controls policy, so again, please get in touch. The fundraising code of practice, there's good guidance there as to what to do in light of COVID-19 and how to adapt your fundraising practices so you can still get that money coming in, which is very important. And then finally, if you haven't got a funding or fundraising policy, then perhaps now is the time to look at putting one in place, because it demonstrates clearly to the outside world how you're going to collect funds or undertake fundraising activities. And I've just on my next slide, so it's about your guiding principles of how you're going to raise funds. It's your approach, it's how you're going to use and handle donations. Also, it's important to sort of explain and be open and transparent, which is part of your good governance. How you're going to manage complaints if a complaint is made against somebody who is fundraising on your behalf, how you're going to deal with that. And although this doesn't happen, or we don't like to think it's going to happen, there may be criteria that you want to apply in terms of where you refuse a donation, because actually that person or that organisation has a particular set of ethics, or comes from a particular maybe political background that you don't want to be associated with. So therefore we also need guidelines, and our funders will need guidelines as to whether there are any instances where you would refuse a donation. I've included some links to some fundraising policies that are online, a pretty varied range, so you can have a look at them. But again, it's just useful to see what other organisations have said. And again, as a final parting comment, I think the reason for having a funding policy now, if you haven't had one, is actually we're probably a bit more remote from our fundraising, because if we're doing it online. So maybe now's a good time to have those guiding principles to ensure that actually our organisation's values and ethics are being supported through the funds that we're raising. I think that's all I have to say, because I think, yeah, the next goes on to funding updates. So I'm going to stop sharing there. Sorry it was really quick, but hopefully you'll follow the slides and get further information, or as Julie said, just get in touch with one of us and we'll be able to help you.
Thank you, Julie. So GDPR, we spent a lot of time talking about this when the policy first came in. And I think it's relevant now to have a little talk about it because, of course, the way in which we're processing data is probably different while we're working largely remotely than it probably has been in the way that we did our practice under normal circumstances. So first of all, I'm just going to have a little chat to those who may be responsible or part of a COVID-19 response group. So these, as I said at the very beginning, have been extraordinary times, and the Information Commissioner's Office have recognised that, and they put out a really excellent blog, which I've put the link to in the slides that I showed earlier that will be part of the webinar resources. And if you are one of those groups and you're not familiar with that blog, I would definitely recommend clicking on it. There's some really good advice on there about dealing with GDPR data protection in a crisis situation. And it's very reassuring, actually, that ICO have really gotten out of their way to reassure groups that they do recognise that this is extraordinary times. So although the legislation hasn't changed over things like, for example, people's right to request their information, the deadlines or everything are still the same. If people are putting in complaints to ICO that groups are taking a long time to release their information, ICO are actually responding by saying, we recognise that it's taking groups longer. So they're not looking at instant breaches in regulation. What they're looking at is the fact that actually they're aware that these are difficult times for people to manage in. That doesn't mean that they handle data breaches lightly, but it does mean that they are recognising that there are strains on everybody's system, and people have had to adapt perhaps quicker and in ways that they wouldn't normally adapt. So some of the basic principles that they talk about is, for example, around sharing of information. A lot of people get very worried about sharing information. And what they say is that even though we're dealing with COVID-19, even though data protection exists, we should still share information where it is in the benefit of the person that we're caring for. So the examples would be where you have a legitimate interest, so they would expect you to share it. So where you've said, well, give me your email address and I'll send it to Adult Social Services so that they can give you they can get in contact with you. That would seem a complete legitimate interest in sharing that information. Even though you may not have written consent, the fact that they gave it to you shows that they have an expectation that you would use it in that way. So that would be one way that you would be able to do it. Consent is always easiest. So if you are there, if you are delivering things and people can sign to give their consent, then that's of course always the easiest way. Or if they can email you to tell you that they give consent for you to share information. Those things aren't always possible when we're looking at remote working. Another important thing is vital interest. If it is in somebody's interest when it comes to their health and their safety, then actually that again can override that right to privacy because you're sharing it because you believe otherwise they would come to serious harm. And again, that could be contacting the police or social services or an ambulance in order to inform them that somebody is unwell or is at risk. So vital interest is another protection that is out there. If you're dealing with special category data, so that's anything from health records to information about somebody's sexuality, their race, their ethnicity, and their religious preferences, then that becomes what we could, as I say, a special category that has to be dealt with more robustly. And that's because that information could lead to harm to a person if that was breached, if that was actually exposed about them. So we need to make sure that we've got additional safeguards in place, that we have consent wherever possible for that information, and that we're doing all that we can to reduce any possible breach that might happen of that information. So we have to think very, very carefully before we collect it. Is it necessary? And if it isn't necessary, don't collect it. Don't hold special category information unless it's part of the service that you're providing and a need to know. Do make sure you keep a record of everything you've done. So the decisions that you make, the reasons why you've done things, because that's the best justification you have for why you've acted in the way that you have. But one of the things, and however good that blog is and however reasonable ICO have been, it is worth mentioning that we are moving from extraordinary times to ordinary times. Not quite sure what ordinary times are going to look like, but we're definitely moving out of extraordinary. And that means people like the ICO are going to be looking at data breaches again in a different way. They're going to be less sympathetic because they're going to start to say, well, actually, you've been operational for 6 months. You've got time now to put policies, procedures, and protections in place. So if you are an informal group, now is the time to start thinking about formalizing your group. And you can do that in a multitude of ways. That could be by joining forces with another group. It could be by coming under an umbrella of another group, like Neighbourhood Watch, for example. Won't change how you operate, but you will be protected by their policies and procedures. It could be by merging a few of informal groups together to create one bigger group so that you've got more protection. And probably the simplest way is by looking at a constitution, something that gives you a set of guidance about the way in which you are operating. There's lots of support we can give you around doing that, and it is probably the best protection that you can put in place to make sure that you are working in the right way. If you are new to all this and you've been listening to us talking about policy and procedures, it can sound pretty daunting, but it's step by step. It's introducing those policies and procedures as you need them in the way that you're working and making sure that what you're doing is as safe as possible. So it's something that can be done step by step with everybody in your group taking a small amount of responsibility. And remember, we're here to help. We can provide you with templates, we can provide you with support, advice and guidance around what to include in those documents. And of course, what we can also do is put you in touch with other organisations who might be able to support you and mentor you as well. So for general guidance, when it comes around GDPR, it's probably worth making sure that you've got their telephone number. And that's 0303 123 113. I'm going to say it again. And if Ray, if you could perhaps jot it down and it could go in the chat, 0303 123 113. Fantastic. Thank you, Ray. Look at that, instantaneous. It's probably something that is worth having and held by everybody who's involved in a charity, because there will always be questions that you have around data protection. Is it okay to do this? We've been working this way, and actually they're incredibly helpful over the phone. I know that's not always the case, and if you've tried to contact any of the main telecom providers to talk about your internet, then you'll probably know that that isn't always the case when you ring up a helpline. But the ICO are very good at what they do and very good at the advice that they give. They will normally, though, use as a default position, refer to your policies and procedures. So it is important that you've got the basics right, but they will help you with some of the, particularly the challenges that we're facing at the moment. Some of the most common questions that have been around at the moment are to do with, we've not been working in the way that we usually do. We've not been able to follow our guidance in the usual way. Does this put us at risk? And what we're finding is that, as I said, the ICO are being very understanding about a lot of this, as long as you are following those basic principles of only collecting what's reasonable to collect and what's necessary, storing it safely, and sharing it only where it is in the interest of the person that you're sharing it to do so, in the conditions that we talked about earlier. They do recognise that there are things that you won't be able to do within timeframes that are currently set, like be able to reply to requests for information, and they take that on board, and they are, as I say, supporting groups. I need to mention about track and trace, and they have provided guidance on that specifically in line with the government guidance. It talks about the fact that you need to ask for only what it is that you need to collect, so keeping it to an absolute minimum. So definitely making sure you don't hit any of those special categories. Don't go asking for the gender or the sex or any other preferences about the person that you don't need to collect. So make sure that the form that you're using only has the very basic information on it. Be as transparent about what you're going to do with that information as you possibly can. So it's really important that it says that it's for track and trace, that it will be handed over if there is an outbreak, but it isn't handed over to anybody if there isn't. So be really transparent. Don't use it for any other purpose. This is not a sly way to collect a mailing list. So that's really important too. Of course, you can link it to your booking data so that you can hold how many people used your premises on any given day, but we shouldn't be able to identify them individually. And make sure that you are storing it effectively. So that means in a locked cabinet if it's a piece of paper, or that it's securely being held if it's in a cloud-based or on a computer system. There are computer systems out there to help with the collection of data. Many people have linked them to things like accessing their internet, which is very clever, where you just collect somebody's name and their email address, and then they get access to your internet, and that's been quite effective for a lot of organisations. And remember, erasure is really important, and you should know that you can only keep it for 21 days. It would be a breach of data protection if you held it for longer. So do make sure you have processes in place to delete that information once it hits 21 days. And that is quite important, because I think for a lot of organisations that have never dealt with data protection before, they're unaware that they have to get rid of it. But you would be in breach. So if you were challenged by somebody who'd been to your restaurant and they were told, oh, don't worry, you came a few months ago, we've still got your details, you may find that you could be in breach of data protection. So please make sure that you are doing that. Don't use it as well as a rolling system. You do want to collect it for track and trace purposes only. You want to collect it for each visit that somebody makes to your premises. Again, a lot of people have talked about the fact that they're worried that a data breach is more likely because of the conditions they're working in with COVID-19. And as long as your policies and procedures are reflecting the change in your working practices, ICO will be understanding. So all those changes that Julie and Anita were talking about before around fundraising and around safeguarding, if those adaptations have been made to your policies and procedures, again, that's good prevention, but also it allows you to be able to provide evidence in the case of a data breach to show that you have been working in best practice during this time. And that really highlights more than anything else that we can possibly say about why it is important to keep policy and procedures up to date. It is your protection, it is your evidence. It's the way that you're able to demonstrate that you're working in the best possible way to safeguard the most vulnerable. If you work with a lot of sensitive data, if that's part of your general day-to-day business, you may want to consider doing a DPIA, which is a full assessment of all of the data that you hold and that you collect and that you store, and the way in which you process that data. We do have templates that we can share with people, and we can also offer advice on how to do a full assessment of your data protection. Because there really is no better way really than having a full assessment of the data that you hold. That's particularly important for people that hold personal, sensitive or special category data. If your data is much more incidental, if it doesn't tend to be identifiable, or it is just being for track and trace purposes, then you don't need to go that far as having a full assessment. Okay, so thank you for that. Hopefully what we've done is given you a very whistle-stop tour of the updates and the needs around policy and procedure. So I hope that that's been really useful. Please do visit the webinar page for all of the links that we've talked about and the extra guidance that we'll provide on there. It will enhance and it will make it easier for you to share with others, particularly along with the recording. So we've got a few little bits of a DCA update that we'd obviously like to share with you. So we've been now doing these webinars for, I believe, 23 weeks, which just seems extraordinary how the time has just whizzed by, and this really does begin to feel like our new normal. But just so that we don't get too complacent, we've begun to mix it up a little bit. So as we move through September, we're going to be changing the way that some of these webinars are being held. So on the first of the month, we will have on the first Wednesday of the month, we will have our usual webinar, which will be the information session, updates on government advice and guidance and from the regulator. The second Wednesday of the month will be training, and will be an opportunity for you to take part in the latest skills updates for you, your team. And again, they will be done online with resources that will be available to be emailed to you. Our third Wednesday of the month will be a network session, and that's an opportunity for you to take part much more. So we hope to open those out, sometimes with themes, sometimes just generally, to encourage people to be able to come and share what they've been doing. And on that point, I'm just going to hand over quickly to Anita and Julie just to tell you about our next training webinar and also our network webinar that's coming up. So Anita, if I come to you first.
Okay, so on the 23rd of September, which is not a Wednesday, I think it's a Thursday, which is just because the way it worked. Or is it a Wednesday? I don't know. Anyway, it is a Wednesday. Okay, the 23rd of September, I don't know what day of the week it is. I am running a online training on successful bid writing. So join me, please. You can book online via the website. It was in last week's e-bulletin. It will probably be going out in this week's e-bulletin, but basically it's covering the main areas to support you to make a successful application for funding. Ray's put a wonderful, you'll see this on our Facebook page and also elsewhere, but that sort of gives you an idea of what we're going to be doing, and also it reminds me what dates we're going to be doing. So now I'm going to hand over to Julie, who's probably got a much better handle of days of the week and dates.
Possibly not. Thanks, Anita. Thank you. So on the 30th, as you can see on there, we have a free networking event. This is going to be a little bit like the old days, but not quite face-to-face and having coffee. The idea is that we share news from the floor, but this is all dependent on how many people attend. So we're really going to see how many people book on, and then decide if we're going to have breakout rooms or if we can just have a bit of a chat and give each other an update on what we're all up to. So really looking forward to that one, just listening to what you've been up to over the last few weeks and months. So that's Wednesday the 30th of September.
Lovely, thank you. So next Wednesday will be our usual webinar style, the traditional, so very much information giving. And as I said before, we hope to do a really good update on the guidance that's being given out today around social gathering. And then the following Wednesday will be Anita's fantastic training session on vid writing. And then the week after that, Julie will be hosting the networking event. We will also still be attending. So as our final bit today, I'm just going to hand over to Anita just for a funding update. And just to talk through any of our latest funding news. Thank you, Anita.
Okay, so we've covered. So just some updates. Again, these will all be in the e-bulletin. So you'll get the links. They're on our website, so you get the links and be able to find out more about the fund that's on offer. A reminder that the Dorset Council Community Impact Fund is open until the 20th of this month. I know that there has been around 15 to 20, not as many as 20 applications. So again, please, 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 can we make sure this is overspent? Just sends the right message to the council, and I know that you need the funds. So please, please apply. If you want any advice, best to contact Julie, because I'm on the funding panel, so there's a conflict of interest. Social Enterprise Support Funds, this last round of this, it's open on tomorrow and closes on the 18th. So if you're a social enterprise that has been impacted by COVID-19, that would be one for you. A note to say that Tesco's bags of help, so at the end of this month, they are changing their focus, and through October, November and December, they'll be funding up to £1,000 to support local children and young people, not whole communities, so they're focusing on the needs of young people. Morrison's also are open to their sort of community grants, so this is a slightly larger pot from 1,000 to 25,000. So if you're near a Morrison's, and there are a few around Dorset, then this could be a grant pot for you. And again, it has a wide range of and a much wider range of activities and groups that will be supported. And then some environment ones. So I'm not even going to pronounce this or try, but if you're looking at environmental projects, or you're looking to support countryside, improving access, then this grant, this charitable trust would be worthwhile applying to. And I did look at some of the previous grant recipients, and it is things like allotments and gardening projects. So it doesn't necessarily, so it looks like you can think a little bit further out of the box than it would initially seem from reading the blurb that I've put on the slides. And then lastly, if you're a rural community organisation, there's funding for renewable energy projects. And there's two parts to this: either a feasibility grant, so you can assess the viability of your idea, and then the actual project development fund, which is up to £100,000. So again, worthwhile having a look at that if you're a rural organisation. And village halls, community associations, those sort of buildings could potentially benefit from like solar panels or ground source heating, those sorts of projects. And there's the opportunity to sell some of it back. So solar farms, we've seen a few of those up around Dorset, where actually the local communities have then actually benefited from a community fund. So yeah, that's the 5 I think I've highlighted. They do seem to be slowing down, the grants, and they do seem to be moving away from emergency response and even recovery to a certain degree, and going back to sort of their more normal funding priorities. So that is something to be aware of. And that's all I have to say, really. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you, Anita. So the final slide I'm just going to put up is just a reminder, really, of support that is available. Everything that we've talked about today about changing the way that we're practicing during this time and the increase in remote working. I saw in the chat, Nick mentioned that the council are going to continue working from home up until March. So this is something we're going to see as a trend, definitely within all industries. So if you're worried about your digital skills, if you're worried about them in relation to your particular village hall or your particular community group, then make use of the help that's available through the digital champions. By upskilling yourself, what you're also able to do is upskill those you support. And so it's a really important thing to do. Do come back to us if you'd like more information about that. You might also be sat here thinking, oh my goodness, I'm not sure our policies were that good to start with, and now they're talking about updating them further. We can help. If you're a new community group and you're worried about how you're going to transition into being a more sustainable group, again, we're here to help. And we're here to help you keep up to date with what is rolling continuous changes to guidance. 2 ways that you can contact us, I've just put up on the screen, and these slides obviously will be part of the resources that are available after this webinar. You can see an advisor for a 30-minute online conversation in order to look at particular areas of need. We obviously go on to be able to provide strength checks and also policy writing support. There are lots of other bits that we can offer on top of that, but they all start probably with that initial conversation. And then we've got signing up to our e-alert. Make sure that you get regular contact from us and know what's going on. Lovely. A lot of information today. I expect your heads are spinning. So we're going to let you go, have a cup of coffee, and think about the changes that you might need to make. As always, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to seeing as many of you as possible next week. Thank you very much. Thank you. Number 4. Hello.
Oh my God.
God, there's a lot of information, wasn't it?
Wow. Yeah.
Oh dear. Yeah. Thank God we made that decision about the village hall to cut that down. But I had actually forgotten all about it. But you did really well. That was all it was, is just reminding them that we have provided you with all the information already. Oh, brilliant work. Brilliant, brilliant work, all of you. It's excellent. I have to say, I'm loving the fact that you're looking more